A widow in white waits at midnight. But what for? Or who? Welcome to Grey Whisper. I'm your host, Silas Drex. Tell me where you're joining from. I love seeing this community connect. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It was on one of those peculiar April mornings when the fog clings to the cobblestones like a sullen spirit and the chimneys breathe long, sighing puffs, that Mrs. Hudson, in her usual brisk yet quietly reverent manner, delivered the post to our sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street. I, Dr. John Watson, was at my desk transcribing notes from our recent trip to Sussex when I heard Holmes murmur, "Curious." He held in his long fingers an envelope of thick ivory paper. The script on its front was slanted and precise, almost unnaturally so, as if written by someone desperately trying to suppress a trembling hand. The wax seal bore no family crest or monogram, only a simple, smooth indentation, as if deliberately unmarked. Without waiting for me to comment, Holmes slit it open with the corner of his letter opener and silently read the contents. I watched as his brows furrowed, then lifted. "She waits," he said quietly. "Draped in white. Every day, precisely at 4 o'clock. I set down my pen. "She who?" Holmes handed me the letter. "Dear Mr. Holmes, for the past 9 days, a woman dressed entirely in white has stood outside my home on Cavendish Crescent at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She does not speak. She does not knock. She simply waits. She carries no bag, wears no bonnet, and despite the recent rains, she does not carry an umbrella. She stands still for precisely 47 minutes, then departs as silently as she came. I implore your discretion. I cannot bear to involve the authorities, as my household is still in mourning. Yours in urgency, Mrs. Georgina Lavington, No. 8, Cavendish Crescent, Hampstead." Holmes reached for his pipe, but made no move to light it. "There's something unnervingly specific about 47 minutes, he said, still staring at the fogged window. "It suggests ritual, or message, or madness," I offered. He ignored me. "Tell me, Watson, what do you recall of the Lavingtons?" I searched my memory. "Sir Ambrose Lavington passed last month, did he not? Former director at the Bank of England. Heart failure. It made the society columns because of some rumored dispute over his estate." Holmes gave a small nod. "And now his widow sits in mourning behind velvet curtains while another, veiled in white, performs a daily vigil at her doorstep." He stood abruptly and began pacing. "Why white, I wonder? Not mourning black, not widow's grey, but bridal white, or madness white." I stood as well. "You're going to visit her, then?" "Indeed, a woman who waits in silence is either a message or a threat, Watson, and in London, either may prove deadly." We set out not long after luncheon. The fog had begun to lift slightly, curling in thin wisps around the gas lamps as our cab made its way to Hampstead. It was a sullen ride, Holmes speaking only to mutter occasional observations about the habits of cab drivers and the curious absence of public clocks in the northern districts. Cavendish Crescent was a quiet, well-mannered street of slate-roofed homes and trimmed hedges. No. 8 loomed at the end, a pale, ivy-clad townhouse with mourning ribbons still tied around the knocker. A black wreath sagged slightly above the doorframe. Before Holmes could lift the knocker, the door opened as if summoned by his intent. "Mr. Holmes," said a woman in her late 50s. Her face was pale but composed, and her voice trembled just enough to betray her nerves. "Thank you for coming. I believe you are Mrs. Georgina Lavington," Holmes said with his slight bow, "and you are not the only woman in white on this street." The widow led us into a sitting room where the heavy curtains were drawn tight and the scent of lavender and old paper filled the air. A portrait of the late Sir Ambrose stared sternly down from above the mantel. "She will come again today," said Mrs. Lavington, her hands clasped tightly. "I have not yet spoken to her. I cannot. She frightens me, Mr. Holmes, though she has done nothing more than stand." Holmes turned to the window, pulling the curtain back with one long finger. "It's 3:45, he said. "We shall see what 47 minutes of silence tells us." And so we waited. At precisely 4 o'clock she appeared. Through the mist, emerging from the far end of the crescent, came a slender figure. She was dressed head to toe in a white gown, neither fashionable nor ragged, but oddly plain. No bonnet, no bag. Her hair was dark and fell in a simple braid, and though we were 3 stories up, I could see that her gaze was fixed firmly on the Lavington house. She stopped on the opposite curb, folded her hands in front of her, and stood utterly still. Holmes did not speak, nor did the widow. The seconds passed, then minutes. A black cat slinked down the sidewalk, pausing momentarily before skittering away from the motionless figure. I stole a glance at Holmes. His face was unreadable, though his eyes flicked constantly, studying. At exactly 47 minutes past 4, the woman turned, walked away without a glance back, and disappeared into the descending fog. Mrs. Lavington let out a trembling sigh. "You see?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, madam, and I intend to see more." He turned to me. "Watson, we begin this case as we begin all great cases, not with what is seen, but with what is unseen, and today, I believe, we witnessed silence loud enough to be called a threat." Holmes did not speak for several minutes after the white-clad figure vanished into the mist. He remained at the window, fingertips pressed together before his lips, eyes narrowed as if trying to trace her retreat through sheer will. The drawing-room fell into an uneasy hush, broken only by the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. Mrs. Lavington stood, wringing a handkerchief in one gloved hand. You see how she stands? As if waiting for something, or someone. But for what purpose, Mr. Holmes? Why doesn't she knock? Why doesn't she speak? Holmes turned at last, his expression unreadable. "Because what she wants, madam, is not inside your home." She blinked, but then, "Why come here every day?" He stepped forward, not unkindly. "That is precisely what I intend to discover. But first, I must ask, have you spoken to your staff about her? The housemaid, the butler?" Mrs. Lavington hesitated, only to tell them not to engage. "Mrs. Blythe, my maid, believes she is a spirit. She won't go near the window anymore. And Hargreaves, my late husband's valet, he simply ignores her, though I suspect he's unnerved as well." Holmes nodded. "And this woman? Has she ever varied her approach? Has she crossed the street, looked in the windows, or tried the door?" "Never," Mrs. Lavington said. "She stands as if she has all the time in the world." Holmes moved about the room now, fingers trailing across surfaces, studying the layout of the furniture and the sight lines to the street. "Forgive me, but I must ask bluntly. Are you certain you have never seen her before?" The widow's face paled. No. At least I do not think so. Her face is partially obscured, and she does not come near enough." He paused by the hearth. "Might she be connected to your late husband?" Mrs. Lavington's lips parted, but no answer came. Holmes watched her carefully. "You hesitate." "I don't wish to slander the dead," she said quietly. Watson, seated to the side, interjected gently, "Sometimes, madam, the truth must briefly wear an unflattering coat in order to be of use." She gave a faint, resigned nod. Ambrose was a man of routine and secrecy. I do not pretend I knew all the corners of his past. He traveled often, and there were rumors, of course. What powerful man escapes them? But he was a loyal husband, at least by appearance, and generous in his way. Holmes merely inclined his head, then glanced toward the corner of the room. "Is that his study?" "Yes. I've kept it closed since his death." "Would you object to my examining it?" Mrs. Lavington hesitated, then retrieved a small brass key from a dish near the door. "It hasn't been touched. Everything is as he left it." Holmes opened the door carefully and stepped inside. Watson followed, noting the air was still heavy with pipe smoke and old books. The room was orderly, lined with bookshelves and an imposing mahogany desk. Holmes drifted immediately to the desk, scanning its surface. Everything neatly arranged, a blotter, inkwell, stationery, and a locked drawer beneath. He knelt briefly to examine the rug behind the desk, lifting its edge to inspect the floorboards. Watson moved toward a low bookshelf and spotted a row of leather-bound ledgers. "His banking records?" he asked. "Likely," Holmes replied, eyes now fixed on a picture frame sitting at the edge of the desk. It contained a photograph of Mrs. Lavington in younger days, seated in a garden with Sir Ambrose beside her. But there was something curious. The picture had been trimmed to an oval shape. The edges bore faint signs of older corners. A previous frame, perhaps, or the removal of another figure. Holmes said nothing but pocketed that thought. He turned his attention to the desk drawers. "Watson, this one's locked. Kindly check that key our hostess gave us." Watson tried it. It fit, and with a satisfying click, the drawer slid open. Inside were 3 small items: a pale blue ribbon, folded with delicate care, a silver locket on a long chain, and a letter tied in twine. Holmes unfolded the letter, scanning its contents. Watson watched as his friend's face shifted slightly, just enough for Watson to know something had clicked. "What is it?" he asked. Holmes handed him the letter. "Read it aloud, if you will, but slowly." Watson did so. "My dearest G, I've tried to do as you asked. I've stayed away. I've kept the promise I never wanted to make, but I fear I cannot much longer. Every April, my heart returns to that day in Hyde Park, the day I said yes and you said we must forget. If ever you change your mind, you know where to find me. I will wait. Yours always." Monsieur Watson looked up, brow furrowed. This was not written by his wife. Holmes smiled faintly. Number, and it was certainly not written to her either. He placed the ribbon and locket gently back into the drawer and closed it. "I believe," Holmes said, "that the woman in white is not mad nor malevolent. She's waiting because she was told to, and because someone broke their promise." They returned to the drawing room. Mrs. Lavington rose expectantly. "Well," Holmes was thoughtful, "I would like to ask your permission to observe from one of your upstairs rooms tomorrow." "Alone?" Mrs. Lavington blinked. "Alone? I believe the woman is aware she's being watched. Her pattern, her stillness, it's all too precise. She means to send a message, but not to a crowd. Tomorrow I will receive that message." "I suppose so," she said uncertainly. Holmes turned to Watson. "We'll stay at the Langford Hotel tonight. I need the distance to think clearly. But tomorrow at 4, I shall return here alone. And I suspect our ghostly visitor will do more than merely stand and stare." They departed into the mist, which had grown thicker now, muffling even the clip of horseshoes on stone. Watson, walking beside Holmes, could contain his curiosity no longer. "You believe this woman is a former lover?" "More than that," Holmes replied. "I believe she is someone Sir Ambrose loved deeply and parted from under a secret agreement, perhaps to preserve his position or reputation. That letter was not the first between them. I would wager she wrote annually, perhaps even visited in secret. But now, after his death, she breaks that silence." Watson mulled this over. "But why wait? Why not simply knock and speak to the widow?" "Because the woman has pride," Holmes said, "and perhaps fear. The dead man owed her something, an acknowledgement, a promise, perhaps even protection. But now that he is gone, the rules have changed." Watson nodded. "You said earlier that what she wants is not inside the house. What did you mean?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because, Watson, she's not here to speak to the living." Watson stared. "You believe she's here for the dead?" "I believe," Holmes said quietly, She is here to claim what was never given, and if I am correct, she will do so soon. In white, as a bride who was promised, then cast aside. They walked in silence after that, the fog folding around them like the close of a curtain. Neither spoke again until they reached the hotel. In the distance, a church bell tolled 5 o'clock, and somewhere back in Hampstead, a woman in white was walking away, her eyes still full of longing and her 47 minutes spent. Tomorrow she would return, and Sherlock Holmes would be waiting. The following morning dawned with a reluctant sun, casting a pale light across the rooftops of Hampstead. Holmes had risen early and spent the hours between breakfast and departure in a curious state of stillness, reclining in the corner chair of our hotel room, his gaze fixed on the smudge of soot that drifted lazily up from a nearby chimney. I had learned long ago not to interrupt him when his mind was thus engaged. At precisely 1 o'clock he stood, adjusted his cuffs, and declared it was time. 3 hours early? I asked, surprised. Too many answers lie behind those curtains for me to risk arriving only at the moment of encounter, Holmes replied. The house must be still, the staff dismissed or occupied, the room prepared precisely to my advantage. I must not be observed by her, but I must see everything. We returned to Cavendish Crescent, where Mrs. Lavington, though visibly fatigued, admitted Holmes without question. She seemed somehow smaller than the day before, her pride dented by the quiet suggestion that her late husband's life had included more shadows than she wished to see. "The upstairs parlor," she said as she led Holmes through the dark paneled halls. "It overlooks the street but sits back enough that you won't be seen if the curtains are handled carefully." Holmes surveyed the room. The window faced east, framed by heavy brocade drapes. From behind them, a person could peer through the gauzy inner layer and see the crescent without attracting notice. A small writing desk had been placed beneath the window, ideal for Holmes's intent. "Leave the door unlocked," Holmes said. "No one is to disturb me, and should she leave anything behind, even so much as a slip of paper, do not touch it. Let it rest until I examine it." Mrs. Lavington nodded gravely and departed. I made to follow her, but Holmes placed a hand on my arm. "You, Watson, are to wait 2 blocks south, by the horse trough. I'll send for you if needed. I don't like the idea of you being alone with a stranger who may well be unbalanced." "Nor do I," Holmes said, "which is why I intend to confront no one. Only to watch, for now." Reluctantly, I agreed and left him to his vigil. From the street below, the house appeared as it always had, stately, symmetrical, its ivy trailing over the grey stone like veins. There was no sign of the woman in white yet, though the hour was early. Time passed slowly. At exactly 4 o'clock, the figure appeared once more. She came as before, emerging from the fog at the end of the crescent, her posture unchanging, her steps measured. She wore the same plain white gown, now slightly frayed at the hem. Holmes watched as she crossed the street and assumed her usual position across from number 8. But today, there was something new. A small bundle was clutched in her hands, wrapped in pale cloth, tied with twine. Holmes narrowed his eyes. She stood for her usual interval. 47 minutes unmoving, but instead of leaving as she always had, she took a final step forward. With great care, she bent and placed the bundle on the edge of the walkway, just outside the gate to the Lavington property. Then, with a glance upward, perhaps toward the curtained window behind which Holmes sat, she turned and walked away. Holmes remained motionless until she vanished. Only then did he rise. He descended swiftly, collecting Mrs. Lavington and beckoning for Watson to return. When all three stood together in the vestibule, he gestured toward the bundle resting quietly at the gate. "Watson," he said, "would you do the honors?" I moved cautiously forward, kneeling to inspect the object. It was a small parcel, about the size of a loaf of bread. The twine untied easily, and within the folds of linen lay an envelope and a single red shoe, child-sized, delicate, old. Mrs. Lavington gasped. A child's shoe, I murmured, turning it over. It's been repaired many times. Holmes took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a sheet of thick paper bearing only 3 words, written in a careful, trembling hand. She never knew. He stared at the note for a long moment. "Who is she?" Mrs. Lavington asked, her voice small. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he turned the shoe over again and examined the inside heel. With his thumb, he gently pried up the inner lining, revealing the edge of something folded. He withdrew a scrap of brittle, yellowed paper, barely larger than a stamp. On it was written a name. Watson leaned in to read it. Clara L. Grafton. Mrs. Lavington drew back as if struck. "You know the name?" Holmes asked. "My husband." She pressed a hand to her temple. Years ago, he had dealings with the Grafton family. He offered them assistance during some scandal. I was never told the details. Ambrose said it was business, nothing more. Holmes gave a slight nod. "That much may be true. But I believe Clara Grafton was more than business to your husband." He turned to Watson. "Recall the letter we found in the study. Signed, Eames. This shoe, this scrap, they are not the remnants of a passing affair. They are artifacts of a life that was hidden. A daughter, perhaps. A promise unfulfilled." Mrs. Lavington was visibly shaken. "A child. You mean he had a child with this woman?" Holmes gave her a steady look. "It is a possibility we must consider. The woman in white may be Clara herself, grown, returned, or perhaps the daughter of him. The note says she never knew. That implies secrecy. Perhaps the child was told nothing. Perhaps she's only recently discovered the truth." Watson shook his head. "But why the shoe? Why the waiting?" "Because grief, Watson," Holmes said softly, "does not always cry out. Sometimes it waits, in silence, hoping the world will finally notice what it ignored." He folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket. "We must find this Clara Grafton, or her daughter. There is a registry office on Leadenhall Street. I'll begin there. Watson, I'll need you to visit Sir Ambrose's solicitor. Ask for records of private bequests or unlisted beneficiaries." "And me?" Mrs. Lavington asked. "You, madam," Holmes said gently, "must prepare yourself. Because the dead do not always rest where we think they lie, and some truths walk the streets in white." As the sun faded behind the roof-tops and the fog began its evening descent once more, Holmes turned toward the long shadows of the city. Somewhere in that silence, a name waited to be remembered, and Sherlock Holmes had just begun to listen. By the following morning, the fog had rolled back into the Thames, revealing a sky bleached white by thin spring clouds. Holmes was already at the window of our Baker Street sitting room when I entered, hat in hand, returning from my errand to Sir Ambrose Lavington's former solicitor. I saw him raise a brow before I had even opened my mouth. "Well," he said, without turning. I set my walking stick against the umbrella stand. Sir Ambrose's solicitor was reluctant at first, but when I mentioned your name and suggested there might be a potential claimant to an unregistered bequest, he relented enough to allow a review of Lavington's private files, those kept separate from his official estate records. There were 2 handwritten entries under the name Grafton. One refers to a recurring sum, £50 quarterly, paid out to a Miss Margaret Grafton over a span of nearly 17 years, beginning in bin sekis jus sexen bir Holmes nodded slowly. Margaret, not Clara. A generation apart, perhaps. The second, I continued, is a final provision. Dated only 6 months before Sir Ambrose's death. It specifies a one-time trust to be released upon his passing, intended for a Miss Clara L. Grafton, provided she appears in person to claim it. Holmes turned now, and a flicker of interest lit his eyes. "Aha, that smacks of unfinished business and of guilt." "There's more," I said, retrieving a small envelope from my inner coat pocket. The trust stipulates that the solicitor not attempt to contact Miss Grafton. She must find her own way. Holmes took the paper from my hand, examined the language, and gave a dry chuckle. Typical. Lavington wanted to control the terms of his shame from beyond the grave. Give, but only if she asks. Atone, but never confess. He tapped the paper against his palm. And yet she has come. Not to ask, not to plead, but simply to wait. He moved to the map of London pinned above our writing desk and circled a spot with his finger. Clara L. Grafton, born likely around 1878 or 79. We must find where she has been and where Margaret, her mother, lived. If the quarterly payments ended 17 years after 1881, then Margaret may have died around 1998. I asked about that, I said. The last payment to Margaret Grafton is dated October 1898. There's no record of her death in the file, but there was a note in the margins beside the entry, no forwarding address after payment posted. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. She vanished, or was made to vanish. We spent the next few hours in the records room of the General Registry Office, where Holmes pursued his research with unyielding focus. It took time and patient sorting of birth ledgers, electoral rolls, and census records. But at last, a few threads emerged. Margaret Grafton, seamstress, had rented a room in a boarding house on Catlin Street in Lambeth for over a decade, beginning around 1881. In 1883, she gave birth to a daughter, Clara Louise Grafton. No father listed. By 1898, both names disappear from the rolls. I suspect they were driven to move after the payments ceased, Holmes said, leafing through a final page. Without Lavington's assistance, they would have had little to survive on. We visited the old boarding house in Lambeth, now a crumbling shell with its shutters drawn and paint flaking from the brick. The landlady who answered the door was not the same as in Margaret's time, but she remembered hearing stories. "Ah, the Grafton woman," she said, nodding slowly. "Lived quiet, she did, always working at her mending. That little girl of hers, Clara, used to wait for her outside with a rag doll. Poor thing, always looking down the street like she was expecting someone." "Do you know what became of them?" Holmes asked. The woman hesitated. "Not rightly. Margaret got sick, I think. The girl went to stay with someone else. After that, I lost track." Holmes thanked her, and we returned to the street. He paused on the stoop, drawing a slow breath. "Watson, imagine what it means for a child to grow up waiting at the window every week, every month, while her mother receives silent coin but no visits, no letters, no name to call her father. Then, one day, the money stops. The mother grows frail, and the child is left with unanswered questions. Do you see the shape of it now?" "I do," I said. "And you believe she only discovered the truth recently?" "Or perhaps," Holmes said, "she always suspected, but only dared to confront it when death made confrontation possible." We returned to Cavendish Crescent that evening and were shown in by Mrs. Lavington, who appeared as worn as the widow's weeds she still wore. "She hasn't returned," she said immediately. "Not since the parcel." "She will," Holmes assured her. "She's not yet done." "She left a shoe, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Lavington said, voice brittle. "A child's shoe. That feels like an accusation." "She left evidence," Holmes replied calmly. "Evidence of a wound, one that festered for decades." They sat in silence for a moment before Holmes spoke again. "Do you still have your husband's letters?" The widow blinked. "What do you mean?" "Correspondence, journals, datebooks, anything he kept near." She nodded slowly. "Some were boxed after his death. Others are still in his desk." "I'd like to see them," Holmes said. "Even fragments can speak volumes." He was allowed back into the study, where he spent the next hour sifting through drawers, loose notes and letters folded into long unused books. Most were mundane, communications with bankers, minutes from meetings, newspaper clippings. But among them, tucked inside the sleeve of a ledger, Holmes found a note on blue paper, brittle with age. To be opened in the event of my death. If she comes, tell her I thought of her every spring. Tell her the magnolia tree was planted for her. Tell her I was a coward, but not a stranger. L. Holmes held it a long while, then folded it and slipped it into his pocket. He rose, stepped to the window and opened it. Below, the magnolia tree in the Lavingtons' modest front garden had just begun to bloom, white petals curled like secrets. The air was silent. Holmes turned. "Watson," he said, "tomorrow we will visit an old nursery in the East End, one known for its pale magnolias. What do you expect to find there? A name, a receipt, perhaps even a delivery address. A man does not plant a tree for someone he wants forgotten, but a man like Ambrose Lavington might hope a flower could speak for him when he no longer could." He closed the window gently. "Tomorrow," he said, "we follow the blossoms." The next morning broke with the faint scent of blossoms in the air, a gentle reminder that spring had begun to whisper through the streets of London. Holmes, already dressed in his grey suit and travelling cloak, stood by the fire, sipping a single cup of black coffee. I found him thus when I descended from my room, and he greeted me only with a brief nod and a single sentence. "The nursery we seek is called Penhaligon and Sons, Whitechapel, established 1864, renowned for its magnolias and an uncommon discretion." We set out without further delay, boarding a cab that trundled through the thinning mist and into the heart of East London, where the streets narrowed and shop fronts bore the wear of long years and soot. Penhaligon and Sons was tucked away behind a rusted iron gate, with greenhouses reaching like glass shoulders out of the small courtyard. The scent hit us as we stepped through. Damp earth, lemony blossoms, and the unmistakable sweetness of early magnolia. A man in his 60s, bald on top but with impressive side whiskers, approached us with hands still dusted in potting soil. "I'm Charles Penhaligon," he announced. "You've the look of men who ask questions, not buy bulbs." Holmes smiled faintly. "Very astute. Mr. Penhaligon, I'm Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. I'm here on a delicate inquiry concerning a tree, a magnolia, planted at number 8 Cavendish Crescent in Hampstead some 20 years ago. Might you keep records of such orders?" "Trees, not customers, are my true companions," Penhaligon said. "But yes, I do. My father began the practice, handwritten ledgers, all of them, right back to the opening day. Come." We followed him into a back room where rows of old journals stood on a shelf. Penhaligon pulled down a book marked Year 1889 to 1892 and flipped through it with remarkable ease until he stopped at a line written in a tight, practiced hand. "Here we are, January 17th, 1890, one white magnolia grandiflora, 3 years mature, to be planted in early spring at Cavendish Crescent. Ordered by Sir Ambrose Lavington. No note of occasion, but he paid a premium for discretion." Holmes leaned closer. "Is there a delivery instruction?" "Just this." Penhaligon tapped the line. He wrote, "To be planted just beyond the gate. She will see it." Holmes exhaled, a quiet sound almost lost beneath the ticking of the wall clock. "She will see it," he repeated softly. So the tree was a message, left in living bloom where words were forbidden. Watson furrowed his brow. "She, as in Clara. Or Margaret," Holmes murmured. "But more likely the child. If he planted the tree in 1890, the girl would have been 7, an age when memory begins to etch itself into permanence. He planted it not for the woman he cast aside, but for the child he could never claim." We thanked Mr. Penhaligon and stepped back into the street. Holmes paused before entering the cab. "I need to know," he said almost to himself, "whether Clara ever did see it." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sent out 2 telegrams, one to the Royal Free Hospital to inquire about any Margaret Grafton admitted in the year 1898, the other to the principal registry for any updated employment records on Clara L. Grafton from 1899 onward. While we waited, he took to pacing, pausing only to snatch volumes from his shelf, flipping rapidly through their pages before discarding them again. "Do you believe she's the woman in white?" I asked finally. "I do," Holmes said. "Everything fits. The timing, the name, the child's shoe, the silence. But what troubles me, Watson, is that she never tried to speak with Mrs. Lavington directly. That she stood outside day after day, leaving only tokens, symbols, but no voice. She may feel her presence alone is accusation enough." Holmes nodded, but his face remained taut with thought. "And yet something is missing. Grief is predictable in its irregularity. It either flares into confrontation or retreats into absence. Clara has done neither. She performs." At that moment, the first telegram arrived. "Royal Free confirms admission of Margaret Grafton, November 1898, aged 39. Cause of death, consumption. Listed next of kin, daughter Clara L. Grafton, age 15. Address provided, Miss Langley's house for respectable girls, Clerkenwell." Holmes smiled without joy. So Margaret died poor, and Clara was sent away. A respectable refuge. She would have grown up there, under strict governance, likely forbidden from speaking of her past. "Or of her father," I added. Holmes tapped the telegram. "But she listed herself, gave her own name. That small defiance tells me she never truly forgot." The second telegram arrived later that afternoon. "Clara Louise Grafton, employed as teacher, St. Agnes School for Girls, Bethnal Green, 1903 to 1907. Left post without notice. No further record found under that name." Holmes read it 3 times before speaking. "She vanished, or changed her name, or was made to." That evening, as Holmes sat by the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin, I could sense the pieces falling into alignment. He stared not at the fire, but through it, as if some vision played behind the flames. "She knew," he said suddenly. I looked up. "What did she know?" "That she was being watched. Remember yesterday when she left the shoe? She looked at the window. That wasn't coincidence. She wanted to be seen, but she also wanted control of the moment. You think she'll return? I think she's already written the ending in her mind. She's waiting only to perform it." That night passed with little sleep. I awoke before dawn to find Holmes already dressed. "She'll come today," he said simply, "and today I must speak with her." We arrived at Cavendish Crescent just after 3. Holmes took his post behind the curtain upstairs once more, but this time he left the window open just an inch. Enough for sound to pass. Enough for breath to slip free. At precisely 4 o'clock she appeared. Her gown was whiter than ever, almost glowing against the dimness of the street. She held nothing in her hands this time, no shoe, no parcel. She stood still, as always, but not as before. Holmes whispered, just once, from the window, "Clara." And at that sound, the woman turned. Slowly. She looked directly at the open window, her expression unreadable, and for the first time in 10 days, she crossed the street. Not toward the door, but toward the tree. She knelt before the magnolia and reached out, not to pick a blossom, but to place something beneath it. Then she stood and walked away, not looking back. Holmes descended the stairs without a word. We followed him outside. Beneath the magnolia tree, nestled in the soil, was a photograph of a young girl holding a rag doll. On the back were written 3 words, faded but firm. She remembered everything. Holmes stared down at it for a long moment. Then he placed the photo into his pocket, not as evidence, but as a memory. "She will not return," he said. And he was right. Holmes did not speak as we left Cavendish Crescent that evening. The photograph rested safely in his inner coat pocket, and though I longed to ask what it truly meant, what he had seen in Clara's final gesture. His silence forbade interruption. His expression was not one of triumph nor even resolution, but a kind of quiet ache, as though a wound long buried had been uncovered. Not his own, perhaps, but one he felt all the same. We returned to Baker Street with only the sound of our footfalls for company. The lamps had begun to light across the city, their glow caught in puddles from an earlier rain, and the fog crept low once more, wrapping corners and alleys in its familiar veil. At last, inside our rooms, Holmes shed his coat and went directly to the writing desk. He placed the photograph down before him and stared at it beneath the lamplight. "She remembered everything," he murmured. "Not accused, not begged. Simply remembered." I sat across from him. "You believe this concludes it?" He gave the smallest shake of his head. "Number, not entirely. We've seen the end of Clara's vigil, but not yet the fullness of her story. There's still something unsaid. I can feel it. Her message was not vengeance, Watson. It was memory. But even memories point to truths left unspoken." I waited, watching the flicker of the lamp reflect in the glass over the photograph. The girl in the image, surely Clara herself as a child, held the doll tightly, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with expectation. She looked just past the camera, as if someone stood beside it, someone she trusted to appear, but who never had. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers resting near the corner of the picture. "We need to know what happened to her after she left the school. The trail goes cold in 1907. She disappears. She could have married, changed her name, moved abroad. Or, Holmes said softly, she could have waited too long." His eyes flicked to the fire. "We've been looking for Clara Grafton, but we must consider that she is no longer that woman. Not in name, perhaps not even in circumstance, and yet she stood at that gate, in white, with perfect stillness. That sort of grief is not new. It is weathered, practiced." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a telegram with a faint frown. "For you, Mr. Holmes. Arrived from the Central Employment Bureau." Holmes took it, opened the paper, and read. Then he exhaled. "It seems," he said, "that Miss Clara Grafton did not vanish entirely." He laid the telegram flat for me to see. Clara L. Grafton re-registered under married name. Clara Dorsham. Entered Public Records 1910. Employed as housekeeper, Hillgrove Asylum, Kensington. Resigned position May 1916. No further employment listed. No death certificate recorded. I looked at Holmes. "Hillgrove Asylum?" "Yes." He rose from the desk and reached for his coat once more. "An institution for the convalescent and emotionally disturbed. Primarily women. If she worked there, she did so by choice, and if she resigned suddenly, there may have been cause." Within the hour, we were at the gates of Hillgrove, a grey structure whose tall windows bore the expressionless stare of all such places, emptied of life but not of history. The matron, a thin woman named Miss Bellworthy, led us through to her office. "Clara Dorsham?" she said, retrieving a large ledger. "Yes, I remember her well. Calm, well-mannered, if a bit distant. She kept to herself, rarely took visitors. Left just before the war." "Was there an incident that prompted her departure?" Holmes asked. Miss Bellworthy hesitated, fingers tapping the spine of the ledger. "There was an episode. Not with Clara herself, but with a patient. A woman admitted under false name. Middle-aged. Brought in by private physician. Lasted only a week before she was transferred. Some scandal with the admitting family. I was never told the full story. But Clara was deeply shaken. She requested to leave that very day." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you have records of that patient?" The matron stood and returned with a thin file. She opened it and laid it before us. "Name, Mary Langridge. Age, 43. Admitted, April 28th, 1916. Transferred May 5th, 1916. Holmes stared at the file, then said quietly, "Language is a false name. This woman may have been Margaret's sister, or someone from Clara's past. And Clara knew it." He pointed to the physician's note in the margin. "Look at this. Watson. Patient became agitated when shown photograph by staff nurse. The photo's description is redacted, but I would wager it resembled the very one Clara left beneath the magnolia. Are you saying this patient was Clara's mother? Number Margaret died in 1898, but perhaps this woman brought news Clara had never received, perhaps a letter withheld or a truth buried." He stood suddenly. "We must find Clara, not the girl she was, not even the woman in white, but the woman who walked away from this place carrying a secret only she understood." Miss Bellworthy tapped the final page in the file. "Her forwarding address upon resignation is here, though I cannot say if she still resides there. It's in Bayswater." We thanked her and made haste. The house was small, tucked behind a row of narrow gardens. When Holmes knocked, we were met not by Clara, but by a woman in her 20s who introduced herself as Mrs. Elspeth Dorsham. "My mother?" she said with a puzzled frown. "No, she doesn't live here anymore. She moved out just before the winter. She wasn't unwell, only quiet. She said she needed to leave London for good." "Did she leave a new address?" Holmes asked gently. Elspeth nodded. "She went to St. Leonards-on-Sea. Said she wanted to be near the water. She took only a few things, some old letters, a box of photographs." "She spoke of the past?" "Rarely," the young woman said. "But I remember one thing she said when she left. She looked at me and said, 'Sometimes the only way to forgive is to forget publicly, but remember privately.' Then she kissed my forehead and went." We stood at the garden gate a moment later, and Holmes stared east toward the direction of the sea. "She left the city," I said. "Do you think we'll find her?" "No," Holmes said, "but that's no longer the purpose." He reached into his coat and removed the photograph once more. "Clara left this behind, not to be found, but to be understood. That little girl with the rag doll. She waited once, and then she became the woman in white, waiting again, and now she walks away, finally." He handed the photograph to me, and for the first time I noticed something else, a faint watermark on the edge. Dorsham Studios, 1906. She had preserved it all those years. "She remembered everything," Holmes said again, softer now. "But she chose not to speak. That was her final deduction, Watson. Not ours." I understood then what Holmes had seen all along, not merely a mystery to be solved, but a wound to be witnessed, and in witnessing it, perhaps, he had offered her what Ambrose Lavington never could: closure. For several days after our last visit to Bayswater, Holmes withdrew into a pensive silence, one that hung thick in the air of our Baker Street rooms. He neither sought new cases nor read the papers, though I often found the photograph of Clara, the girl with the rag doll, propped against the lamp at his desk, as if it were not merely a clue, but a companion. I refrained from interrupting this quiet stretch of contemplation. It was, after all, not the first time Holmes had become occupied by something more emotional than empirical, though such occasions were rare and always marked by a peculiar stillness that never quite felt idle. On the third day, however, he stirred with purpose. "You remember the trust?" he asked me as we shared breakfast, "the one Sir Ambrose established for Clara, contingent upon her appearing to claim it?" "Yes, she never did." I laid down my fork. "You believe that matters now? Not to the law, perhaps, but to Clara. It may still matter, even if only as a symbol." He stood, pacing slowly between the window and the hearth. "Imagine, Watson, carrying the weight of illegitimacy, silence, and abandonment through the decades. Then imagine the one man who could publicly name you, define you, dies, and yet even in death leaves your legitimacy conditional. That trust was never meant to be claimed. It was meant to soothe his conscience. She knew that, I said. Precisely. That's why she never went to the solicitor. Why she stood outside the house rather than inside it. Her silence was her judgment. He paused by the window, watching the city breathe below. But I wonder, he said more to himself, if there is something Clara left undone, not out of fear, but out of design. I looked up. What do you mean? Holmes turned. In our pursuit of her path, we've followed the trail she allowed to be found. Records, photographs, appearances. But I suspect there's one more piece she deliberately left behind. Something less direct. A key, perhaps, to be discovered not by her family, not by the solicitor, but by someone who understood the structure of silence. He opened his desk drawer and removed a small parcel I hadn't seen before. This arrived this morning, he said. Unmarked, no return address, but the handwriting matches the letter we found in Sir Ambrose's study. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a narrow, leather-bound notebook and a folded piece of music manuscript paper. Holmes handed the music to me while he leafed through the notebook. The sheet bore only a few bars, light, wandering melody lines, penciled in with delicacy. Beneath the final note was a single line of text. I waited for the notes to return, but none did. So I wrote my own silence. It's a composition, I said, but incomplete. Exactly, Holmes said, holding up the notebook. And here, in the final pages, a series of initials and dates. None explained. He flipped the book to show me. Names and numbers, some with time markings in the margins. CLG 1895. CD 1907, ED 1921. They looked like entries, perhaps milestones, but cryptic. She's writing her own history in code, I murmured. Holmes nodded. And the music? It's not a piece meant for performance. It's notation as metaphor, a silence rendered in symbols. We spent the afternoon decoding the journal. Piece by piece, Holmes arranged the names and numbers chronologically. It became clear that the entries marked encounters, some moments of correspondence, others, meetings. CLG appeared most often, Clara's own signature, but in later years, ED began to appear more frequently. Elspeth Dorsham, her daughter. She was writing her daughter into the ledger of her life, Holmes said, not just as kin, but as witness. Then came an entry that made Holmes sit back. AL 1911, underlined. That's Ambrose, I said. But he was never known to have visited her. Exactly, Holmes whispered. Which means he did. Holmes leapt from his chair and pulled the blue letter from Lavington's study out of his file. He laid it beside the journal. They align, he said. The date on this note and the one in Clara's ledger. Same week. That's when he saw her. But the letter says if she comes. Tell her. It was written later, Holmes said. Out of fear. Not of her, but of himself. He visited her once, saw the truth he had buried, and recoiled. The silence lingered between us. At last I said, so what does she want us to see now? Holmes tapped the music sheet once more. She wrote silence, but she left this, the unfinished melody, the ambiguous journal. It's not a confession, it's an invitation. She wanted someone to follow, not solve. I stood. Then what is left for us to do? Return to Cavendish Crescent, Holmes said, already reaching for his coat. One last time. We arrived just before dusk. Mrs. Lavington greeted us with polite unease, still uncertain what part this quiet drama played in her late husband's legacy. But she let us pass without question. The magnolia tree stood full now, blossoms unfurling like whispers. Beneath it, nothing new had been left. But Holmes did not look to the ground. He looked up. Watson, he said, pointing toward the side of the house. "That attic gable window. Do you see the boarded panel at the base?" I followed his gaze. The lower half of the window had been sealed with wood, though the upper pane remained open to the elements. "She saw the tree from there," Holmes said. "That's what he meant. She will see it. He had it planted in direct line of that window." "Are you suggesting Clara was once inside this house?" Holmes nodded. "Only briefly. Perhaps just once. Perhaps as a child. But it stayed with her. Enough for her to find the address again, years later." He turned to Mrs. Lavington. "Madame, was that attic ever used?" She looked startled. "Only as a storeroom. Old trunks, curtain rods, broken furniture. My husband forbade the staff from clearing it. I thought little of it." "I would like to see it," Holmes said. She hesitated, then relented. "The key is in the cupboard. I'll fetch it." Minutes later, we stood in the narrow attic, the scent of dust and cedar filling our lungs. Holmes moved slowly, scanning the corners. A child's chair sat near the window. Beside it, a cracked glass jar held a single dried blossom, long dead, yet preserved. Watson knelt beside the jar. "She left it here, years ago." Holmes touched the sill. Or perhaps she never truly left. He turned, and for the first time in days, his voice warmed. "She didn't come to haunt this house. She came to finish something, her own melody." I asked, "Will we ever see her again?" "No," Holmes said gently. "But we've seen her story. That was what she offered. Not vengeance, not inheritance. Just memory, made visible. She waited in white so the truth would not pass unseen." And so we stood in that quiet attic, the last breath of sun falling over the magnolia blossoms below. The silence around us filled at last, not with absence, but with presence. Clara had written her silence into history, and we had read it. We descended from the attic in silence, the late sun casting long shafts of light across the stairwell, turning dust into golden threads that hung motionless in the air. Holmes lingered a moment at the bottom step, glancing once more over his shoulder as if listening for something left unsaid in the timbers above. But the house remained quiet, save for the tick of the long case clock in the hall. Mrs. Lavington had withdrawn to her room, leaving us alone in the drawing-room. The photograph of Sir Ambrose still hung above the fireplace, watching us with the same cold impartiality as ever. Holmes lit his pipe and stood before it, arms folded, the reflection of the flame flickering in his eyes. "She never truly wanted confrontation," he said. "If she had, she would have forced an audience, stormed the solicitor's office, demanded acknowledgement, but that was never her aim." I nodded slowly, still absorbing the impression of the attic window and the brittle blossom sealed in glass. "She wanted to be seen," I said, "not as an heir, not even as a daughter, just as someone who waited." "Exactly," Holmes murmured. "The tragedy wasn't that Sir Ambrose denied her. It's that he remembered her, mourned her in silence, but never allowed that remembrance to live outside his own conscience. The magnolia, the trust, it was all constructed so she might one day forgive him without ever hearing the words. And now she has," I said, in her own language. Holmes turned to me then, and his face bore an expression I had seen only a few times in our long acquaintance. Not triumph, not curiosity, but an almost painful clarity. "Watson, you recall the phrase she left beneath the photograph. She remembered everything. And yet she left nothing else behind. No claim, no letter, no explanation. What remains is only what we've uncovered. Her stillness, her silence, her symbolic farewell. She gave us just enough. No more." There was a long pause. "She trusted us to see it," I said at last. Holmes inclined his head. "And so we did." The days that followed passed with a quiet that felt more earned than empty. Holmes resumed his usual routines, though with a noticeable slowness to his stride in the early mornings and a slight hesitation before opening the daily post, as if expecting another envelope bearing no return address. But none came. Instead, on the 5th day, a small item in the corner of the Times caught my eye. I had taken to scanning the pages at breakfast, half out of habit and half in curiosity for any aftershock from the case we had just concluded. What I found was brief. A column of local announcements, half swallowed by news of Parliament's latest debates. A small ceremony was held yesterday at Hillgrove Asylum in Kensington, where a magnolia tree was planted in the gardens, in memory of a former housekeeper, Mrs. Clara Dorsham, who served from 1910 to 1916. The dedication, initiated by a Miss Elspeth Dorsham, included a short reading from an unnamed composition and a note of gratitude to those who knew silence does not mean absence. I passed the clipping to Holmes without a word. He read it once, folded the paper carefully, and slipped it into his inner pocket. No name in the article, I observed. No mention of the connection to Lavington. She chose to let that part die with him, Holmes said. Elspeth, too. That was not the story she wanted to pass on. But she did leave something, I said. She left a melody, a ledger, the photograph. Holmes smiled faintly. Yes, and more than that. She left a method. Clara Dorsham, became in the end something like a detective herself. She constructed her message in the same way I've often done, obliquely, symbolically, with patience. She set a stage, knowing that someone would one day follow the threads. I stared into my coffee cup, letting the quiet truth of that settle. Do you regret anything? I asked. That we never spoke to her directly? He shook his head. Number her language was silence, Watson. If we'd interrupted it, we might have broken something sacred. Sometimes the detective's job is not to interrupt, but to understand. There was a knock at the door then, Mrs. Hudson, delivering the mid-morning post. Among the stack of bills and correspondence was a narrow, cream-colored envelope with no writing on its front. Holmes turned it over in his hand. There was no seal, no emblem, only a faint scent of lavender pressed into the paper. He opened it. Inside was a single scrap of parchment. On it, drawn in the same delicate hand as the musical score from before, were 3 descending notes. A rest, then a final, upward lift of a phrase, unfinished, like breath that catches before it can become a word. Holmes held it up to the light. No signature, no message. Only a faint pencil inscription on the back, barely visible. Not everything is meant to resolve. We sat in silence after that. There was nothing more to pursue, nothing more to deduce. Clara had left her story in pieces for us to find, and now, with this final gesture, she had released the last of it, not into the world, but into the care of someone who could understand its shape without needing to force its meaning. That evening, I found Holmes seated at the violin, something he hadn't touched in weeks. He played not the melancholic chords he often favored, but a series of soft, unfinished phrases, hovering on the edge of familiar, yet never quite completing the thought. He did not try to recreate Clara's melody. Rather, he seemed to be answering it. When he paused at last, letting the final note drift into silence, he looked to me. Not for approval, but in the way one does when asking if a moment has been witnessed. I nodded. She never wanted a verdict, I said. No, Holmes replied. Only a listener. And with that, he set down the violin, turned away from the window, and allowed the silence to settle, no longer empty, but full of everything she had left behind. The following days moved with a peculiar softness, as though time itself had taken its cue from the final note of Holmes's violin, that unfinished phrase still lingering between sound and silence. He did not speak of Clara again, nor did I press him, for the matter seemed to have passed into that small category of our cases that were never truly solved, but simply understood. And in truth, the case had not ended with revelation. It had ended with restraint, Yet even restraint, I would come to learn, does not always equate to finality. It was a late April morning, brighter than most, with sunlight warming the brass on our windows and the scent of rain still clinging to the paving stones below. Holmes had resumed his correspondence with the Home Office and was once again occupying himself with the trivial inquiries of minor lords and discontented baronets. I had just returned from the chemist when I found him seated with a letter open upon his knee, a curious expression lingering beneath his calm. He glanced up. "You remember Elspeth Dorsham?" I sat down across from him. "Of course. Clara's daughter. Has something happened?" Holmes nodded slowly. "She has written to me. No return address, though the letter was posted in St. Leonard's-on-Sea." He handed it to me. The handwriting was neat and undecorated, neither formal nor sentimental. "Mr. Holmes, I write not to reopen the past, but to close it with dignity. My mother passed away last week, quietly and with no unfinished pain. She left little in the way of possessions. One trunk, some letters, a few journals, and a folded cloth within which lay a single shoe, small, red and long since outgrown. I knew of its meaning, but never spoke of it with her. That was her choice, and I honored it. But there was one thing she asked of me before she died. She said, 'When the time comes, he will know what to do with it.' And so I send it to you. With quiet gratitude, Elspeth Dorsham." Beneath the letter, Holmes had placed a parcel, neatly wrapped in brown paper and string. With care, he undid the twine and opened the cloth. Inside, resting precisely in the center, was the other red shoe. For a long time, neither of us spoke. At last I said, "She kept them both, even after all those years." Holmes ran a thumb along the worn edge of the heel. "She left one as a message, and kept the other as memory." I leaned forward. "You believe she meant for us to reunite them?" Holmes did not answer at once. He reached instead for the box of case files we had begun for Clara, an informal archive of notes, letters, and photographs. From it, he retrieved the first shoe, the one she had left at the gate of Cavendish Crescent. He placed the two side by side on the desk. They matched, not just in size and shape, but in the faint curve of the leather, the stitching that had been repaired by the same hand. Likely Margaret's. Together, they no longer felt like evidence. They felt like closure. "Not everything is meant to resolve," Holmes said softly, quoting the final note she had sent us. "But some things are," I replied. He looked at me then, and there was something unexpectedly vulnerable in his gaze. "Tell me, Watson, where does memory belong when those who lived it have gone?" I thought for a moment, then said, "Where someone can remember it rightly." Holmes gave a faint nod, as though he had expected nothing else from me, and yet was grateful to hear it aloud. That afternoon, he requested that I accompany him once more to Hampstead. We arrived at Cavendish Crescent without fanfare, the street unchanged except that the magnolia was now fully in bloom, its petals trembling faintly in the spring wind. Mrs. Lavington answered the door herself and seemed surprised to see us. "You've come back," she said, her voice uncertain. Holmes removed his hat. "For one last moment, madam. Nothing more." She allowed us in, and Holmes made directly for the garden. There, beneath the tree, he knelt and cleared a small space at the base of the trunk. With gentle hands, he placed the two shoes together, wrapped in the same cloth that Elspeth had sent. Then he set a small stone atop it, flat, unmarked. Mrs. Lavington had come to stand at the threshold of the house, her hand resting lightly against the frame. "She's passed, then?" she asked. Holmes did not look up. "She has. I often wondered," she said after a pause, "what he might have done had she come to the door, if she had demanded to be known." Holmes rose, brushing his hands. He would not have answered. He had chosen the manner of his guilt and the limits of his courage. She closed her eyes, then nodded. "Perhaps that's true." As we turned to leave, she stopped us once more. She left something behind, you know. Not just the shoes or the photograph. She left an awareness. Of what? I asked gently. Of what silence can hold, she said, and what it can hide. We parted then with no more words. On our return to Baker Street, Holmes seemed unusually subdued. He did not sit at his violin. He did not write. Instead, he took the small journal Clara had kept, the one with initials and dates, and placed it carefully on the middle shelf above the fireplace, nestled between two unread volumes of Persian poetry. When I asked why he placed it there, he said, "Because this house has seen many stories, but few as quietly true." The fire burned low that night. I thought of the shoes beneath the tree, the attic window, the unopened trust, the unfinished melody. Not a puzzle solved, but a story concluded. And as the hours slipped past and Holmes finally rested his eyes, I realized what we had been part of. Not a case, not a mystery, but a requiem. For a girl who waited, for a man who didn't answer, and for a silence that finally, gently, spoke. Several weeks passed in a hush, as though the city itself had absorbed the silence Clara left behind. Our rooms at Baker Street resumed their usual rhythm. Clients came and went with lesser grievances, a vanished will, a curious stain, an unlocked door found ajar in the night. Holmes, though dutiful in his attention to these matters, did not truly re-engage. His mind, I knew, remained elsewhere, not in uncertainty, but in reflection. One morning, as the spring rains softened the city into grey again, a small box arrived by post. No return address, only Holmes's name written in a restrained, almost clerical hand. I found it on the table beside the unopened newspaper and placed it beside him without comment. He did not open it immediately. He merely regarded it for a time. Fingertips steepled under his chin, eyes narrowed in that particular way of his when a thought tries to take shape in the fog of memory. When he did open it, he did so slowly. Inside, nestled within a nest of thin tissue, lay a length of cream ribbon, delicate, once white, now gently yellowed with time. Folded within the ribbon was a note, unsealed and unsigned. It was hers, the one she braided into my hair when I was small. She said it made the world feel softer when everything else was hard. I thought it might belong to the place where the silence bloomed. Holmes did not speak. He did not need to. He rose, retrieved the small journal from the shelf where he had placed it weeks before, and slid the ribbon inside, marking a page without bothering to see which one. That evening, we dined quietly, and when I remarked that it felt as though a chapter of something personal had closed, Holmes looked out the window for a long time before replying. "No, Watson, it didn't close. It simply chose not to shout its ending." He returned to his work over the next days, more out of rhythm than necessity. One case involved a counterfeit watchmaker in Clerkenwell, another an actor who claimed to be haunted by a former role. And yet through them all, Holmes's gaze often drifted back to that shelf, to the journal where the ribbon now rested. But what followed, the final flicker of Clara's presence, came not from her hand, nor Elspeth's, but from an unexpected place. It began with an article in the Evening Standard, one Holmes might have ignored were it not for the word Magnolia printed in bold at the top of the page. The piece was a modest one, written by a local editor, and described a growing interest in the private gardens of Hampstead. A section highlighted the now widely remarked upon magnolia tree at Cavendish Crescent, calling it a living monument to some unnamed sorrow. The author continued, "Visitors have noted that beneath the tree, an unmarked stone rests, accompanied in spring by a careful arrangement of blossoms, always the same, 2 reds and a single white, placed with such deliberation that one cannot believe it done by mere weather or coincidence. Residents say the woman who tended it no longer returns, and yet each spring the pattern reappears. Holmes folded the paper and set it down. "It is being remembered," he said, "even if no one knows what they remember." I glanced at him. "You think Elspeth still tends the site?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else noticed and followed the pattern. A gardener, a neighbor. It doesn't matter. The symbol lives on, like a melody hummed without knowledge of its composer." And then, after a pause, he added, "Would you come with me?" "I'd like to see it for myself." We returned to Hampstead 2 days later. It was early morning, the streets still empty save for milk carts and dogs being walked by coatless boys. The house at number 8 remained unchanged in its architecture, though the paint on the front gate had been redone, fresh, dark green, and elegant. We said nothing as we approached the magnolia tree. And there they were, 3 blossoms, placed gently in a perfect triangle at the base of the tree. 2 red, 1 white, nestled against the flat stone Holmes had once laid himself. He did not kneel this time. He merely looked down, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. After a time I said, "The triangle. Do you think it represents something?" Holmes nodded. 3 women, Margaret, Clara, Elspeth. 3 lives, shaped by one silence. I asked, "And the colors?" Holmes smiled faintly. Red for the wounds carried, white for what was given in spite of them. He crouched then, brushing a fingertip along the edge of the stone. "You see, Watson, most legacies are not titles or fortunes. They are patterns, actions repeated until someone recognizes them. Clara didn't ask the world to know her name. She asked the world to remember her presence, and now it does, without needing to know why." We stood a while longer before returning to the city. That night, Holmes did something I'd not seen him do in months. He opened the violin case and carefully tuned each string, not with his usual impatience, but with quiet attention. Then, without a word, he began to play. Not the improvisational fugues or the agitated harmonies of past cases, but something slower, measured, wistful. I recognized the motif after several bars. He was finishing her melody. No longer suspended in silence, no longer left open. It rose gently, filled out with new harmonies, not to explain her, not to define her, but to honor her unfinished thought. It was a requiem, yes, but also a benediction. When he finished, he sat for a long while, the bow still in his hand. "It's not about solving," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. "It's about listening to what remains after the story is no longer told." Outside, the rain had started again. Soft, unhurried, like the fading footfalls of someone walking away for the final time. And in that sound, Holmes and I sat together in shared silence. But not absence. Never again absence. It was nearly a month later, well into May, when I returned to Baker Street one crisp evening to find Holmes seated by the hearth, not with a case file or the violin in hand, but with a small bundle wrapped in wax paper. He looked up as I entered, and the faintest shadow of a smile crossed his face. "You'll be pleased to know," he said, "that we've received a final note from Elspeth Dorsham." He handed it to me without ceremony. The envelope bore no return address, but the paper inside was scented faintly with lilac and folded with great care. "Mr. Holmes, I wanted to thank you, not for what you found, but for what you left untouched. I've returned once more to Cavendish Crescent, not to stand in mourning, but to stand with clarity. I laid the blossoms myself this time, not in sorrow, but in recognition. The world never learned her name, but I believe it hears her silence, and that is enough." With gratitude, I folded the note and returned it to Holmes, who replaced it in the case beside the photograph, the ribbon and the 2 shoes, now bound gently together, like verses in a poem only we were meant to read. "She understands now," I said. Holmes nodded. "And so does the street, And so, I suspect, does the city. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the firelight drawing soft angles along his face. You see, Watson, in most investigations we deal in facts, in the clarity of motive and the hard edge of deduction. But every now and then we come across something far more fragile, a truth so intimately human that to name it fully would shatter it. Clara's story was never meant to be exposed. It was meant to be understood. I stirred the fire absently, letting the warmth of it soak into the quiet of the room. And her waiting? It was never about justice, was it? No, Holmes replied. It was about being seen. That is all she ever asked of the world. To be seen, and perhaps, in her silence, to remind us all of those whom time forgets, though they wait at the gates of memory. He rose then, walked to the window, and looked out over the London streets, where the gas lamps glowed soft in the dusk and the city pulsed forward, unaware. It was, I think, he said quietly, her finest deduction. I joined him at the window. Below, life continued. A boy pushed a cart of apples down the street. A woman hurried home with her shawl wrapped against the wind. A lamplighter paused at the corner, his face half-shadowed as he raised the flame into place. She left us nothing, I said, and yet she left everything. Holmes didn't answer. He simply nodded, turned from the window, and with that familiar grace of motion that accompanied only his most final conclusions, placed the case file in the lowest drawer of his desk. He closed it, locked it, and left it unopened ever after. For the case of the widow who waited in white was not a crime to be punished, nor a secret to be revealed. It was a life to be remembered. And Holmes, the most rational of men, had done what no court or confession ever could. He had given that memory peace, 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 memory